Hello everyone, it is I, Empyrean Serpent, and today we are on the final leg of the top 100 metal albums from 2019 list. So, for today we have a list of the top 10 metal albums of 2019 specifically, which is last year at this time of recording, and last year was pretty fucking spectacular for metal releases. In any case, we may as well get into things, so here are my favorite 10 albums of 2019. Starting at number 10, we have Kull with Exile, a symphonic black metal band that formed from the ashes of Balsagoth, who are one of my personal favorite black metal bands, and definitely who I would call the absolute best symphonic black metal band out there. If you haven't heard them, I would definitely recommend checking out their album Starfire Burning, but in any case, the more important question is, how does this new band hold up in comparison? And, generally speaking, it holds up just as strong. The musicianship on here is spectacular. Tons of great performances, especially with the new vocalist, who has quite a bit of vocal diversity and great energy at that. Some really high-quality harshes, and some pretty spectacular tone for the narrative moments on here, giving off a very inspirational feel. Musically, this thing matches pretty well too, the black metal riffing on here being absolutely fantastic, a bit of death metal influence to some of the riffs here too, giving some more variety, generally being pretty heavy and intensive riffing at that, many of the riffs tending to help the atmosphere quite a bit as well. And speaking of that, the atmosphere on here is pretty damn great, especially with the symphonic aspects of the album being so well done and building it up so spectacularly. The songwriting is consistently spectacular, tons of highlights on here, with a ton of great standout melodies, great cohesion, and a very driving feel overall. There are essentially no aspects of the album that I wouldn't consider great. The production and mix on here are really well done too. It's a fantastic time all around, and an album that I would absolutely recommend looking into. Definitely my favorite black metal album of the year. At number 9, we have Meridiem by Tanagra, a progressive power metal band that is very unique in their approach to the genre, going for probably the most atmospheric style of power metal that I think I have ever heard. And on top of being very unique and interesting, this release sounds amazing, covering a variety of different emotions and moods throughout, whilst keeping a very consistent yet fresh sound. The musicianship is pretty damn good here, especially in regards to the rhythm section and the solos on the release. The vocals are pretty great, generally feeling a bit more toned down and subtle, which blends well with the more progressive, atmospheric approach the band takes, though keeping a consistently great tone and showing some really good emotion whenever necessary. Songwriting is spectacular on here, all of the compositions have some great diversity to them, with tons of fairly lengthy tracks on here, allowing for lots of room to string together different, interesting ideas and build up some amazing atmosphere. None of the time feels wasted either, since practically every moment of this album is gripping, and the only repetition used is on the catchiest parts of the album. The riffs on here are pretty high quality, some very catchy ideas throughout with a lot of great tie-in to the atmosphere, and there can be some reasonable intensity to the riffing too. The lead lines and vocal melodies are generally just as catchy, if not more so, and generally flow with the mood very well, helping to intensify the emotional impact of each track. Production and mixing are pretty good on here too, no real complaints with any of that, as the sound on here is generally fantastic. Thanks to the blend of different elements and more unique approach to the genre, Tanagra managed to craft a stunningly beautiful and compelling album here, one that I would absolutely recommend looking into. For number 8, we have Paladin with Ascension. So Paladin are another fairly new band, primarily playing in a more power thrash style, though with leanings of melodic death metal thrown in for some added intensity. On top of that, some of the shredding on here is quite reminiscent of what you'd find in more neoclassical power metal, so that's definitely an additive. As far as the album itself goes, it's pretty great. The performances on this thing are fantastic, some spectacular technical proficiency shown all around, and some pretty strong and catchy clean vocals, as well as some solid harshes blended in throughout. The songwriting here is even better, making great use of that proficiency to showcase some flashier playing that helps amp up the intensity, and generally this thing is quite intense and fast-paced, with a mix of heavier and thrashier riffs, though with a general focus on melody despite that. As such, the lead lines and vocals tend to carry all the main melodies and memorable moments for most of the tracks, with some exception for some of the spicier riffing and rhythm sections on here. The solos are also fantastic, having some neoclassical tinge to them and generally being pretty memorable and high intensity, and in general the songwriting tends to evoke some very driving, uplifting, and motivational feels, taken to a slightly more aggressive conclusion than most power metal, but maintaining that triumphant atmosphere and mood overall. And, of course, the tracks are catchy as hell and very fun to listen to overall. Another fun thing to note is that at least some of these tracks are definitely based around video games, although the references are masked pretty well. The opening track is based around Link's Awakening for certain, and Black Omen is totally a Chrono Trigger reference, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were more references among the other songs on top of those. But anyways, fun little facts like that aside, this album is some absolutely stellar power thrash that focuses more on melodic sensibility than the average power thrash band, while still retaining and even outdoing the intensity of most other power thrash bands on top of that. Definitely recommend taking a look at this release, it is some great stuff. At number 7 we have Matheos with Winter Ethereal, this album being a product of John Arch, one of the ex-vocalists for Fate's Warning, and Jim Matheos, the current guitarist for Fate's Warning. So in essence, this can be viewed in part as a Fate's Warning album. If you don't know who Fate's Warning are, they are a fairly renowned progressive power metal band, though currently, at least, they lean a lot more towards just pure progressive metal. That being said, some of the earlier albums they released are considered some of the absolute best in the genre. I would totally recommend checking out The Spectre Within or Awaken the Guardian, for instance, but back to the topic at hand. This Matheos album is interesting in that it feels like an alternative timeline of Fate's Warning to some degree, where they kept up more of their power metal influence. The album very much feels like a very progressive metal-oriented album, but there is a distinct power metal flair to all of the melodies, riffs, and vocals on here, giving it a great boost to the intensity and emotion of the riffs and melodies when needed. In regards to songwriting, this thing definitely leans heavily into what you'd expect from progressive metal, generally having some pretty large-scale compositions with tons of variety to the riffs and melodies and separate sections of each song, though with a bit more repetition to the catchier moments as you'd expect from the power metal influence here. And generally speaking, the compositions on here are fantastic. Each song has tons of great unique turns to it, and generally is extremely memorable. The riffs on this thing vary a ton, going from leaning more into the atmosphere and creating a more emotive mood to fully driving that section of the song forwards with a great mix of serenity and intensity and a decent amount of emotion in between. Similar can be said about the lead lines and vocals, though those melodies are generally more of a primary focus, and as such are almost always incredibly memorable and emotive. The performances on here are fantastic, some great solos and leads, spectacular rhythm section, and stunningly high-quality vocals throughout, and every song on here is a great listen, with the album itself having some great compositional variety throughout. Fantastic progressive power metal album, and one of the best of the year for sure. Next, at number 6, we have Into the Purgatory by Galneryus. Galneryus being a neoclassical power metal band from Japan, one that is generally considered to be one of the best of the genre, and one of the best Japanese power metal bands at that. In my opinion, they deserve even higher praise, as I would count them as one of my all-time favorite bands in general, and quite possibly my absolute favorite power metal band. This band is one of the most consistent in the genre in regards to the fact that they have never released a subpar album in their roughly 20-year run, and on top of that they practically put out an album every year, which is absurd considering they almost always keep up an insanely good level of quality. This album here is hardly an exception, and while I wouldn't count it among the greatest in their discography, it is still easily a fantastic record and definitely outshines a lot of other power metal releases from the year. Siu is one of the most skilled guitarists out there right now, and it certainly shows on this album as usual, with insanely high-quality lead lines and some amazing neoclassical shredding throughout. Yuki naturally does a fantastic job with the keyboards on here, Sho has an amazing vocal performance on this thing, even going into some more operatic tone at times, which works incredibly well, and Fumiya and Taka make up an incredible rhythm section as always. The songwriting here is great on top of that, carrying the band's signature sound and blending some great orchestration into the absolutely fantastic neoclassical power metal compositions here, carrying along the absurdly catchy choruses that you would expect, as well as the high-caliber shredding on the solos. The compositions themselves tend towards either more straightforward, catchy power metal-esque songwriting, which the band does extremely effectively, or longer, more grandiose compositions with a lot of build-up and some nice compositional variety, which, generally speaking, the band also does very, very well. There's a great feeling of intensity, and the whole album certainly gives off tons of uplifting, inspirational, and driving emotion. Great riffs throughout, spectacular melodies, fantastic rhythms. Really no complaints about this release, even if the compositions don't necessarily hit as hard as some of the band's absolute best albums. But either way, this is definitely one of the best albums of 2019. Reaching the top 5, we have Ancient Bards with Origine, the Black Crystal Sword Saga, Part 2. Long-winded title, I know. Ancient Bards are an Italian symphonic power metal band, not too dissimilar to Rhapsody, with some neoclassical influence on top of that, the primary differentiating factors being both the more melodeath-esque implementations and harsh vocals that this band tends to use, as well as Sarah Squadrani's primary vocal performance. As a fan of their previous work, I can also say that I think this is their best album, as they really play more into their own distinct blend here, again having a lot more of a melodic death metal presence to the sound, which both helps push the storytelling elements on here, since this is a concept album, and helps differentiate them more from the slew of similar Italian power metal bands that Rhapsody left in their wake. The performances on here are pretty spectacular. Once again, Sarah's vocals are very compelling. The harsh vocals here complement them nicely, the guitar work is fantastic, and the bass on here is just as technical and interesting, while the keyboards and orchestration help a ton with the grandiose feeling of the album. There are also a decent few drum fills and more intense percussion moments throughout that are pretty impressive and interesting. So far as the songwriting goes, the band tends towards catchier, more straightforward tracks with some good compositional variety throughout, though keeping enough of a similar feel so that everything flows together very well. The primary exception to that being the closing track on here, which is an incredibly grandiose finisher to the album. The riffs on here are pretty strong, ranging between power metal and melodic death metal in approach, though occasionally using some more progressive riffing and melodies in general. In any case, the riffs tend to be pretty damn catchy and tend to match the mood of the song, which varies quite a bit throughout, meaning there's a lot of good variety to them overall. More often than not, there's a lot of great intensity to them as well. As far as the lead lines and vocals go, the melodies tend between beauty and intensity pretty well, and tend to be even more memorable and catchy on top of that. And the closing track is a pretty perfect example of this, blending in some great progression to make a truly grandiose track, packed with tons of amazing riffs and melodies, great emotional intensity, and some high-quality compositional diversity. Coincidentally, I also made a full-length review of this album, so if you want to hear even more information and more analytical approaches to it, feel free to check that out. But overall, this release is an amazing listen, definitely one of the best power metal albums from the year. Next, at number 4, we have The Body Cosmic by Iapetus. So going into this release, I had never actually heard the band before, their debut album being released in 2017, with a demo and an EP a few years prior to that. So a fairly new band, generally speaking, and one that absolutely caught me off guard, since the first single I heard from this album blew me away. Iapetus are a melodic progressive death metal band with a pretty big focus on atmosphere, and fun little fact for this album, Dan Presland does all of the drumming as a guest musician, being known for his work in Ne Obliviscaris, and interestingly enough showing up on another one of my favorite albums this year, Into the Aether by AMDBL. And his performance on here is pretty spectacular, as is the writing for the percussion in general, with some pretty great and memorable drum fills and rhythm sections throughout. Speaking of guest musicians as well, there are another pair on this album, Ethan Navarro, who does some pretty fantastic harsh vocals, and Emmy Pellegrino, who does some amazing clean vocals on here. The guitar work, however, is probably one of the main features of the album, and there's a decent bit to it as well, considering there's a surprisingly present use of acoustic guitar throughout this release, on top of the already dominant presence of the lead and rhythm guitar on the intensive portions of the album. In regards to the songwriting, there seem to be two overarching methods to the songwriting here, most parts being either fairly intensive, more melodic extreme metal-oriented tracks with progressive implementation, the other parts being varied and generally more toned back, relaxing, and much more atmospherically focused progressive portions, the latter tending to make use of a lot of acoustics and more often than not being primarily instrumental sections, which makes up a lot of the album as you would expect. And these two approaches juxtapose each other pretty perfectly on this thing, keeping things very exciting while providing breaks to the intensity, and more importantly, being able to explore a wide breadth of emotion through the varying sections and the contrasts and transitions that they create. Most of the compositions on this thing either fall under being roughly a 2-minute long interval track or an over 10-minute epic, with some exceptions, but this essentially makes every major song on the album feel like an extremely grandiose journey that manages to cover a huge swath of emotion and easily captivates the listener, with the overarching and masterfully crafted atmosphere blended with the high-intensity riffing and vocals and the gripping, catchy melodies throughout. This thing has a ton of variety to the riffs and leads, as well as some fantastic vocal melodies. The writing for the acoustic guitar incorporates amazing melodies into a more atmospheric style. Essentially everything on here is written extremely well and lines up very well with everything else. That and the progression of each of the tracks on here is fantastic to follow and leaves the entire experience feeling incredibly unique. The vast theme of the cosmos certainly helps with both tying into the progression and versatility of the songwriting, as well as with increasing the emotional impact of the songs. And as a bit of a final note, the track For Creatures Such As We may as well be my favorite song of the year, with how much the lyricism and themes of the song speak to me, on top of the stunningly beautiful songwriting. This overall is an absolutely fantastic release, definitely a highly recommended listen, and totally one of the best albums of the year. For number 3 on our list, we have Unlucky Morpheus with Hypothetical Box Act 3. And this album is somewhat of a re-recording of the band's first ever release. I say somewhat because the first iteration of this release did not include the last 3 tracks on the album until it was remade a first time with Hypothetical Box Act 2, though that was, nearly 10 years ago at this point. A little under 10 years at the release of the album itself. So, Act 3 is essentially a re-recording of their own debut. Furthermore, Unlucky Morpheus, if you don't know them, are one of the more well-known metal bands in the Toho scene, which is a game series that spawned a huge and fairly dedicated and somewhat underground following, with tons of different musical artists making compositions based on the soundtracks of the games. Unlucky Morpheus are generally regarded as one of the best in this group of artists, though in regard to their actual style, they are primarily a Japanese power metal band who have recently incorporated more melodic death metal elements into their work, though this release remains primarily J-power. And after all that explanation, if you don't know the band, you might be wondering how a re-recording of an album from a band who primarily uses melodies from a video game that you've likely never heard of made it to the number 3 position on this list. And the reason for that being the writing for this album is insanely good to start off with, and their performances on this re-recording here, not to mention the increase in production quality from the original, are all absolutely fantastic. The melodies on here are insanely catchy and extremely well incorporated into the songwriting and the musical style overall, with some great riffing throughout. The rhythm sections here are both written and performed wonderfully, and the same goes for all the performances in regards to the lead lines, the vocals, and the violin, which is actually fairly common on here, being another interesting key feature of the band. Stylistically, the band does opt towards a more symphonic and neoclassical sound at times as well, helping to make things feel more grandiose, giving a more diverse feel to the compositions and overall sound, and allowing for slightly more intricate songwriting despite these song structures being fairly straightforward to maximize how catchy and memorable each track is. Though there are exceptions to that straightforward song structure, as the final track on this thing is a nearly 10-minute long epic, which is fantastically written with tons of great progression. Though even disregarding the writing, since the writing on this album is more or less 10 years old by now, the performances on here are spectacular and even more tight than the other 2 recordings of the album, and the production and mixing here balances everything out practically perfectly. The production makes practically every instrument on here stand out, whilst keeping everything cohesive and, again, very well balanced. It's a really good job, and combined with the even more fantastic performances on this thing, it makes this version of the album undoubtedly the best version of the album to listen to. And considering how fantastic the compositions are at a base level, I definitely consider it to be one of the best releases from the year. If you haven't heard this band before, absolutely check out this album, as it is not only a fantastic starting point, but again, incredible listen. At number 2, the second best album of 2019, we have Velothi by The Ritual Aura. Now this album is another one on the list that I have already reviewed, so if you want a very in-depth analysis of it, go ahead and check that out. In any case though, the Ritual Aura are a band in the technical death metal scene, though still not particularly well known overall, which is nigh unbelievable when taking into account their music. They are primarily a technical progressive death metal band, though their sound has a ton of variety to it, incorporating lots of varied folk influence as well as some decent orchestral use here and there, and some more jazzy implementation every so often. This release specifically, as you may have guessed if you know anything about the game, is based around the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. Though throughout the story that this album retells, it encompasses a bit more than the plot of Morrowind alone covers, tying all the way back into the very creation myth of the entire Elder Scrolls series, essentially following the story of the creator deity Lorkhan. I won't go into a lore analysis or anything, despite how much I love the game, so if you want more of that, then again, go watch my review. But anyways, the album here manages to blend the thematics of Morrowind in quite well to the music, even covering one of the game's soundtracks for a bonus track, which is an extremely fitting ending, I might add. And the folk instrumentation on this album does tend toward a much more Eastern sound, which coincides quite well with Morrowind, considering a lot of the aesthetics from that game and the Dunmer draw influences from Eastern cultures, so a very neat little correlation there. Getting more into the music, the performances on this thing are all stellar, and at that, there are a ton of them since there is quite a host of guest musicians on this thing, which helps add lots of variety to the release, and the band members themselves all do an excellent job in regards to both the instrumental and vocals. Something pretty unique, actually, is how standout the guitar on this thing is, as it is surprisingly emotive for technical death metal, which fits greatly with the compositions here, and furthermore, the tone on it sounds great. So far as songwriting goes, I don't think I have any complaints at all about this album. Firstly, the track lengths on this thing are all pretty short, all things considered, definitely keeping the more high-intensity technical death metal line of thought. Though despite that, since the tracks all feel very interconnected, there is a fantastic sense of progression throughout the album. And thankfully, with the shorter track lengths, absolutely nothing feels even a bit repetitive, nor remotely overstays its welcome, making the replayability value for this release very high, to say the least. And despite the runtime, there are so many fantastic ideas packed into the writing here, a huge variety to the riffs spanning between a focus on intensity and heaviness and atmosphere, all throughout some varied styles that all tend to be very memorable, the same going for tons of the lead lines and melodies on here, pretty much all of which are very catchy and memorable and very emotionally evocative. The atmosphere on the album is pretty dense and extremely emotive, helped a ton by the masterfully crafted folk sections and orchestral portions on here. The production is great, everything sounds really good, and the fact that all of the unique instrumentation is mixed so well on here is quite impressive. There is an absolute ton to this album, and all of it is done fantastically. Plus, Keening 1, Sigik Kaim, is absolutely a contender for one of the best songs of the year. It is fantastic. Then again, so is the entire album, so I would highly recommend taking a look into this thing, and if you want more information and more of an analysis on it, feel free to go check out my full review. And finally, we have the number one spot on the list, the best metal album of 2019, Veil of Imagination by Wilderun. And despite being my absolute favorite album from the year, I had never heard of this band prior to the first single they released for this album. So I went into this thing almost blind, though with the time frame between the first single and the album release itself, I had already listened to their past discography and ended up a pretty big fan. So Wilderun are a relatively new band, and across each of their releases, their sound has gradually changed more and evolved constantly, with this release being no exception. The band primarily play a blend of folk and progressive death metal, though this album adds a much more orchestral tinge to everything, while easing up slightly on the folk elements compared to their previous works, overall giving it a much more encompassing sound and a very grand theatrical nature to it, something that works incredibly well when taking the compositions into account. Getting into the performances on here, I don't really have anything negative to say to any degree. The rhythm section is fantastic, with some excellent bass, including some high-quality solos, some spectacular percussion with tons of variety to the writing and fills, as well as a ton of evident technical skill on display. The guitar work on here is easily just as fantastic, some pretty high tier riffing, great leads, and some spectacular solos every so often. And considering how progressive the compositions on this album are, all the performances on here are taken to another level of prestige. The vocals on here are absolutely fantastic as well. Evan's cleans are enviously good with such a great range and some amazing consistency, keeping an enthralling tone regardless of volume or strength, the quieter sections being equally as captivating as the more grandiose portions, if not more so. And the harsh vocals are fantastic, some amazing growls on here, and some pretty great reach into upper range for the harsh vocals too. Compositionally though, this album is what I would personally call a masterpiece. Each song on here has a unique structure with incredible progression, beautiful juxtaposition of emotion, all the best kinds of intensity mixed with all the best kinds of serene, enthralling atmosphere, and of course, tons of amazing riffs, fills, melodies, solos, orchestration. It has almost everything that one could ask for done to what is essentially the highest degree of quality. As you would expect, most tracks on this thing are pretty lengthy, though the runtimes are practically irrelevant considering how easy it is to get lost in the sheer beauty and intensity of the music here. The songs once again flowing beautifully through the entire runtime with tons of variety to the structure and sound. And despite that variety, essentially every single melody and rhythm on this thing is at the least really good. Tons of extremely memorable riffs and melodies throughout that stand out above the rest still though, making for some very memorable and impactful peaks in the writing. As far as the atmosphere goes, it varies as you would expect, though generally it has a very majestic and grand feel to it, even in some of the more serene and silent moments of the album. The range of emotion on here is spectacular, with the moods of the songs covering a huge variety from triumph and joy and determination to fear, sorrow, rage. There is so much to connect to in the music here, and so often throughout the runtime on the album that it is practically unreal. The production is fantastic, everything is mixed extremely well and sounds fantastic in correlation to one another, which is a really great feat considering how much orchestration the album employs. I have nothing even remotely negative to say about this album, and I can go on for days about the overwhelming positives of this release, since the best moments on this album are the kind that absolutely will stick with you. If you listen to anything on this list, then this is absolutely the album to listen to, and it absolutely earns the first place position on this list, being, in my opinion, the best metal album of 2019. And that is finally all. As mentioned at the start of the video, this was part of a larger top 100 metal albums of 2019 list, so if you need even more amazing releases from the last year, then go ahead and check out the other portions of this list. If you enjoyed yourself, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for similar content, and if you ended up listening to any of these albums for the first time thanks to this list, I would love to hear your thoughts on them below. Furthermore, if you think I missed an album that you thought deserved to be on here, feel free to tell me in the comments. I always love looking into new music and having discussions about music. And of course, links to all these albums will be in the description. That's all really for this video. Thank you a ton for your time. I have been Empyrean Serpent, and hope you have a wonderful day.